I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome, I'm Kate Cagney, the Director of the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. I'm so glad you could join us today for the next installment in our ISR Insights Speaker Series. For those of you who are unfamiliar with ISR has over 300 affiliated faculty who, along with ISR's excellent staff, conduct research that addresses topics such as wealth and inequality, race and racism, politics and public opinion, as well as a wide range of other topics, including teen drug use, economic behavior, aging, and health. Our faculty come from almost every school and college on the University of Michigan campus, reflecting the true interdisciplinary nature of our work and that of the work of ISR. The goal of our ISR Insights Speaker Series is to create a forum for disseminating research findings of our faculty at ISR for the public good. Past topics have included the impact of negative relationships on stress and health, the continuing impact of COVID-19 on education, and the impact of recent social safety net expansions on poverty. Recordings of those events are posted on the ISR website, and we'll post information on upcoming talks there as well, and on our social media channels. So please check those places out to stay connected. So let me tell you a bit about today's talk. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Libby Hemphill, the director of the Resource Center for Minority Data at ICPSR and an associate professor in the University of Michigan School of Information. Libby studies a number of different topics, including politicians, nonprofit organizations, and television fans to understand how people use social media to organize, discuss, and enact social change. She also studies data curation, especially how we evaluate the impacts of data reuse and investments in curating and disseminating research data. Work has been funded by a variety of sources, including the National Science Foundation, the Institute for Museum and Library Services, the Nayer Prize, Mozilla, the Anti-Defamation League, Amazon, and Discover Text. Today, Libby will talk about the challenges of identifying white supremacist speech online. She'll present her research on what white supremacist speech looks like, especially how it's different from general or commonplace speech, and to determine whether white supremacists try to adapt to avoid detection from social media platforms' current content moderation systems. So just a bit of housekeeping. Please note that we're providing live captioning of this event, and you can view those captions by turning on the closed captioning feature on your screen. Also, we'll have Q&A at the end of the presentation. You can submit your questions through the Q&A feature throughout the presentation, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can before our time together ends. So thank you for joining us today. Please enjoy the presentation, and I'm thrilled to hear about Libby's recent work. Thank you, Libby.
Thank you, Kate. I am thrilled to be here at U of M, and I am glad that you're joining us this year at ISR. So today I'm going to talk about specifically how do we detect white supremacist speech on social media. The majority of this project was funded by the Anti-Defamation League Center for Technology and Society, and a big shout out to them for their support, both financial and social, as we work through drafting a public report from this research. As Kate mentioned, I'm jointly appointed in ISR and the School of Information, and I receive a lot of support from those institutions and my colleagues that make it possible for me to do this work. Let's make sure. So let's just start with the highlight. Like, what distinguishes white supremacist speech from mainstream speech? So first, that they use plural noun forms when mentioning racial and ethnic groups, and the frequency with which they mention those groups are unique. That they use the term white to modify so many nouns that are not racialized until white is attached to them. And in general, they are less profane than the rest of us. I will get into details about sort of who counts as a white supremacist in this work. And I'll go through how I developed these findings too. So these are the three things that distinguish them: plural noun forms when mentioning racial and ethnic groups, white as a modifier all the time, and less profanity. And then another question is, does this change over time? So can we see that they're making adaptations to try to get past content filters or to start to look different? And my answer is not really, that they don't actually change the content of their speech over time. And I know this because of the linguistic markers, so the things that I just talked about, are present on all platforms that I studied, all social media platforms. And the frequency of the topics that they discuss are relatively stable across time. And so I'll review these 5 findings. But first, let's talk a little bit about how I know and what did I study. So I gathered data from 3 different social media forums. The first is Stormfront, which is a public discussion board for and by white nationalists. They identify as white nationalists themselves. This is not a term that I applied on my own. It's their identity that they have expressed. I grabbed just under 275,000 posts from Stormfront. Second, I used the alt-right Twitter census conducted by VoxPol, which is a European organization, to find users on Twitter who have claimed an affiliation with the alt-right or who follow those who claim affiliations with the alt-right. Alt-right as a term is sort of declining in the frequency of its use, but at the time that VoxPol did their census, it was fairly common and widely used. So again, this is a set of people who have claimed to be part of the alt-right, that I haven't designated them that, they designated it themselves. And so those are my sort of 2 groups of white supremacists. So they say that they are white nationalists, or they claim that they are alt-righters, which is the sort of public washing of white nationalism that the alt-right have described how they use that term to escape detection or to look more mainstream. And then the baseline against which I measure sort of differences, like to look for what's unique, is a sample from r/all, which is a sample of everything that's happening anywhere on Reddit. And I sampled 15,000 posts per month over the 5 years that I studied, and have roughly 500,000 posts from Reddit communities. So Reddit, if you're not familiar with it, is a large and diverse online forum where the topics are divided into things called subreddits. And the subreddits may have geographies, like there's a subreddit for Ann Arbor, or they may have affiliations. There's a subreddit for the University of Michigan. One of my favorite subreddits is r sneakers, which is where we talk about sneakers. And so there's a variety of topics that people cover on Reddit, and its data is relatively easy to get. And so I use that as my like mainstream internet or commonplace internet speak. And then the methods that I use to do these comparisons are sort of standard text comparison methods, where we just look at what's different on one or the other. And then word embeddings, which I'll describe each of these as we get to them, dynamic topic modeling, and entropy shifts. So these are sort of basic natural language processing and machine learning approaches to studying text. I did not develop new algorithms to do this. I wanted to see what was possible with limited resources. So I can run almost all of these analyses on my laptop. Some of the bigger ones, like studying Twitter, I needed to use some of the computational resources provided at the university. But again, I didn't make any new computer science to do this. I used existing tools. I see some of your questions coming in, and I will get to them. I think we're going to end up holding them until the end of the talk. Okay, so text comparison, what does that mean? So here is a word cloud. You probably have seen word clouds before. They're not super scientific ways to show information, but I find them pretty compelling as visual features. These are the most common words on Stormfront. And you'll probably notice that the biggest word here is white, and the next is people. Some other things that I want you to notice while you're looking at what is common on Stormfront, I'm going to grab my annotation tool here, that you'll see these plural noun forms: whites, Jews, and as I mentioned, white shows up and white shows up. We also, in this case, I'm showing only the words, and there's a similar version of this that shows the phrases, and things like white power and white genocide and these other modified phrases that include white and then a non-racialized noun show up in those as well. So this is just to give you an overview of like, what does this look like generally? And that's one of the first steps in text comparison, is to just get a sense of what's in there that we need to pay attention to before we start comparing it with other texts. Stop annotating, and we'll go to the next one. Okay, so then when we look at the words that might show up elsewhere on sort of what makes them common. So here all the way to the left are some words that I ended up looking at after having seen what was common in these different places. And then the percent of time that or percent of posts on Stormfront that they show up in, and then the percent on the posts on Reddit. And what you'll see is that, and for each of these, except all of these words show up in both places at least once, but they don't show up in enough posts to be measurable at the 10th or like 10th of a percent over here on Reddit. So that's why they have 0%. And I left out the results for the N-word because that analysis is actually still running. But maybe by the end of the talk, it will have finished. So you'll notice that on Stormfront, basically all of these racialized words are much more common. You're thinking, well, Libby, those numbers are really small. But most of the words that we use are articles like the, or pronouns like I. And so when you start to take away the really common words, you'll start to see these low percentages are actually pretty high for specific phrases, especially this outstanding 19%. 19% of posts on Stormfront have the word white in them somewhere. Compared to Reddit, as you can see, 0.7, that's just outrageously obvious that it's more common in this place. And so that's what I mean by these sort of text comparisons, that these differences are so stark that we don't really need much more math to see them. We just look at these percentages and know it's basically all the time on Stormfront and very rarely on Reddit. So the second thing was to use word embeddings. So a word embedding, we'll go back, is a machine learning approach where we take the individual words and we make multi-dimensional representations of them. And so we turn them into vectors of similar words based on the words that they appear near. And what word embeddings help us do is to see what are sort of similar or synonym words in one place and another. And the example that I'm showing here, and I should, well, before we go back, I'll warn you that there are some inappropriate words that show up in my talk. You're going to see some profanity later too. I've tried to remove obvious slur when I'm thinking through. I tried to remove obvious slurs to prevent sort of them pulling us out of the conversation that we're having. But when you study white supremacy online, you see a lot of nasty stuff, and I've tried to remove some of that here. When we look at a word embedding, the one I'm going to show you is actually from Reddit. And the reason that I'm showing the one from Reddit and not from Stormfront is that I want us to be clear that even on Reddit, there are some patterns that are still similar. So on Reddit, there are probably white supremacists who are discussing things on Reddit that would show up in my sample. They're not labeled as such because I didn't label anybody on Reddit as a white supremacist or not. But I wanted us to notice that even among a sort of general or not explicitly white supremacist community, some of these distinctions are still present. So what this shows us, so we've taken a word embedding for these three words, white, black, and Jew, which I will highlight over here. Okay, so here are the three words that we're showing embeddings for. And even though we have many dimensions on which these embeddings have been created, I've shown it here in just two-dimensional space. So some of the things will overlap because they have a third or fourth or nth dimension in common, and that's why they show up over each other. But things that are in color are similar to that word. So purple is similar to white, and greenish is similar to black, and reddish is similar to Jew, meaning that they show up in some of the same documents, where document here is a comment on Reddit. And what we can see, even in these two dimensions, is that we start to get some groupings where there's a bunch of stuff over here that's about colors generally, right? So we have brown, gray, yellow, green, blue, red, white, etc. That makes sense if we're talking about white and black as colors. Then we start to get into crime, sort of white collar crime. And they may be talking about why would collar show up with black. So it's similar in some way to color, but not as much as it is to purple, which is white here. And then there's a discussion about white supremacy and white nationalism that's over here, that is more close to these plural noun forms. So we see blacks and whites, and here's Jews that start to show up, Arabs. And then, let's see, are these, you can still see these annotations? Okay. But then if we look at the red things, so what look like or are similar to or show up with Jew, we have a bunch of, if I pull this way, okay, there we get other religions. So evangelical, Catholic, Pope. But then we also start to get some racialized terms like Mexicans and xenophobic, treasonous, rapists, gays, homosexuals. This starts to sound not so positive. And then we get up here with privilege and fascism, hypocrisy. Like these are the kinds of things that people, even on Reddit, are talking about when they talk about Jews. And there's nothing wrong with the plural noun form of Jews on its own. It's when it's in combination with some of these other terms that it becomes more clearly a white supremacist trend. But something that I want you to take away from this talk is that even though there is sort of clearly or blatantly white supremacist language, there's also sort of white supremacist adjacent or white supremacist informed language in the ways that we talk about racial and ethnic and religious minorities that are common in all of our spaces, even mainstream spaces and among mainstream or commonplace or not clearly extreme users. So Reddit is not immune, and neither is the rest of Twitter to the kinds of things that we see on Stormfront or among the alt-right. Okay, so we've talked about text similarity and word embeddings. So those are about the words that they use. Both of those are for looking at finding those plural noun forms and seeing that white is a modifier and noticing that there is less profanity. So now we look to see, did what they talk about change over time? And I used a technique called dynamic topic modeling. So in topic modeling, generally, there are basically 3 stages, where first we sort of find topics, which topic is a little bit of a misnomer because it's really just group of documents, where there's a group of documents that have a set of words in them. And when those words are more similar to each other, then the algorithm says these things belong in a group. They call the group topic and they give it a number. So the example topic that I'm using here is topic 7. And I picked it because 7 is a lucky number and because it was relatively easy to pull out. And so what you get from the machine when you run a topic model is a set of words and the probability that they would appear in documents in this topic. So we see white is the sort of most related to topic 7, and then times, make, south are sort of more than 2.5%. And again, because words are each rare, any sort of measurable percentage is meaningful because most words are empty, like the or and, should, those kinds of things. So the machine gives you a set of terms that belong in a topic. In this case, I'm showing examples from Twitter. We're looking at 20 topics on Twitter, and these are the human names that I give them. So the machine gives you a number, in this case, 7, and I called it in my first pass, white South. So I was like, there's something going on here about whiteness and the South. Some of the states in the South in the US start to show up after these top 10 terms, and that's part of why I did it. So then thinking about like, what does that mean? Or sort of what do those words tell us? And then I go back and read the tweets that are in this topic. So you get some general sense from these top 10 terms, and then read the tweets themselves and try to give them a human readable label that means something more than 7 does. And then these are the rough clusters that I found. So where each of these is a topic number. So you'll see topic 6 is about, you see the words China and virus show up in topic 6. And in 9, it's about Germany and a virus, or sort of the German, they're in German and they're about a virus. And those are sort of COVID topics. And then things that were about Trump, et cetera. So those are topic numbers. And then to make it easy to display, I lumped those down again into these 3 topic clusters of culture, politics, and white supremacy. So if we go back here, we have, I leave COVID out of it, but these other sort of women in media, Jews, whiteness go together, foreign policy and immigration, and Trump end up in politics. So on the left, we have Stormfront, and on the right, we have Twitter, that are how often over the 5-year period that I examined do each of these topics come up? And I think the first interesting thing is to look at Twitter, where this band, those are nearly straight lines. Obviously, there's a little bit of variance here, but we stay within that sort of 30 to 40% the whole time. For 5 years, these alt-right folks are basically talking about the same stuff at the same rate. Over on the Stormfront side, we get a downward trend for culture and sort of an upward trend for politics, and it occurs from 2016 and 2017, and nearly all of that is a decline in speech about women and an increase in speech about Trump specifically. So prior to 2016, they were talking about the American presidency. They did talk about the 2016 elections, and they definitely talked about President Obama before this, but the rate at which they talked about the US presidency explains almost this entire gap. And then the white supremacy line is nearly straight. And what I think is interesting about the white supremacy distribution on Stormfront is that it's actually lower than politics or culture. So we might think that they just go to Stormfront to talk about white supremacy specifically, but really they just go to Stormfront to talk to their friends, just like those of us who are not white supremacists might go somewhere else to talk to our friends. And sometimes we're going to talk about why we're friends, which is them talking about white supremacy. And sometimes we're going to talk about other stuff, which is them talking about culture or politics. So the stability of these lines, especially on Twitter, are the takeaway here, that they don't really change what they're talking about too much over time. And last, entropy shifts. Well, what does that mean? And basically an entropy shift is the idea that entropy is based on, like, if I'm receiving a signal, can I identify the source of the message? And this comes from Shannon's theory of communication, which is, again, not new. This is like 60, 70 years. I'm going to skip the math today and talk only about, based on what signal I receive, can I identify the source of the message? And this is an entropy shift diagram. So this is comparing Stormfront and Reddit, and asks whether I can tell where the document originated based on the words that are in it. And the things that show up in purple are indicative of Reddit, and the things that show up in yellow in purple are indicative of Stormfront, and those that show up in yellow are indicative of Reddit. It doesn't mean that they don't show up in the other place, but that they show up in this place so often that chances are, if you see it, it came from that place. So chances are, if we see white or quote, that we're looking at a post from Stormfront, where if we see some of these sort of empty, like, please, want, really words, that we're probably looking at something from Reddit. Similarly, again, we have these plural noun forms, Jews, whites, and then these things that get modified, the white world, the white national, the white genocide, that show up in Stormfront. This 2019, for some reason, the Stormfront also likes to reference specific years. So we see other years start to show up when we look at other years also, that they are marking time by mentioning specific years. And now as I turn into, like, I mentioned that profanity wasn't as common. You'll notice, I'm just gonna underline a couple of them. That profanity is so common on Reddit and so rare on Stormfront that it helps us identify the sender of a document when we find it. that we start to, so we see both politeness, so this sort of thank and please tells us that we're on Reddit, but so do profane comments as well. And that by looking at these entropy shifts, we can see what's different about these two places and what is sort of tells us or gives us clues about where the documents might have come from. So where have we been? I'll go back to say, well, what distinguishes white supremacist speech from mainstream speech? Plural noun forms when mentioning racial and ethnic groups and doing that a lot. White as a modifier for many nouns and less profanity. Before I turn to, and that their content doesn't change over time very much, that these linguistic markers, the plural noun forms, the white adjective, the lower profanity are present on Stormfront and Twitter, and their frequency of topics stays relatively stable over time. Those were those nearly horizontal lines in the graphs. Before I get to the what now, I'm going to pause to take a drink and to look at your questions and see if there's anything that I can answer before I move on, or if I want to save them till the end. So I'll be right back. Okay, some of these I can turn to for a minute. So one person asked, can you explain how the pluralization of words like whites or Jews are indicators of hate speech instead of standalone singular versions of these words? So first, I'm not necessarily arguing that these are hate speech, but rather that they are signals that the speaker is a white supremacist or has white supremacist leanings. So that's the first distinction. The second is why these plural nouns. So when you think about how do those of us who don't identify as white supremacists talk, that it's rare for us to say whites do something or blacks do something. Instead, we're more likely to say white people or black folks or something like that instead. Or we might say, you know, like, so there was an election yesterday. We don't say whites did this. We often say white women or white suburbanites. Instead of using the plural noun form. And with something like Jews, again, like I said, it's not that Jews, the plural noun form itself is bad or hateful, but that when you combine it with other terms, for instance, if you would say, the Jews are walking to the synagogue is not offensive, but if you say the Jews are in charge and taking control, then it becomes so. So it's the, and then what comes after it that make that plural noun form more significant. So I'm going to mark that one as answered. And there was another question about the frequency of terms accounting for deletions. So no, it doesn't account for deletions. And so what do we do if some of the words have been removed? Stormfront basically doesn't moderate. As far as I know, they don't remove things. Or if they do, it's like editorial rather than there's some community norm that's been violated. Reddit does have pretty active moderators and does do more removal. What I think is interesting here is that because the data was still up 5 years later, this is the stuff that moderators missed. I can't comment on what moderators caught, but all of this is stuff that moderators missed. We're going to talk about stop words in a second. In Reddit, I looked only at the comments, not at the posts. White supremacists talk more about the presidency after Donald Trump declared his candidacy. They talked more about Trump specifically, but not the office of the presidency. Yeah. We will come back to, I think I answered what kinds of stuff goes in that. But okay, we'll come back to those. So let's talk about what now. So what should we do about it? So my main takeaways would be that we should de-emphasize profanity. And I say de-emphasize, not remove, but rather that a lot of the current ways that we moderate speech online flag profanity and then review it. And it often gets removed if it's profane. But there might be reasons that it's okay to be profane, like maybe we're angry. And it's okay to express anger and to be profane. The second would be to adjust the pre-processing steps. So there were a couple of questions from folks about pre-processing, and I'm going to talk about what I used as a pre-processing and different steps there. So pre-processing refers to how we prepare text data for analysis. And the steps then are algorithmic. So what are the computational transformations that we make to text before we study it? Where stemming and lemmatizing are ways that we remove information. And the idea is that we want to reduce the dimensions so that we can find larger patterns. But when we reduce those dimensions, we lose information like plural noun forms that are useful. And we should do things like keep pronouns because they, like the or that, which is not a pronoun, but these sort of indicator words. The third is to tune large language models or to train models with specific speech data sets. I'm going to come back to that in a second because that's a pretty computer sciencey answer. And then we can train moderators differently to recognize subtlety and nuance in ways that they haven't been able to so far. So let's dig into these a little bit. Pre-processing. So here is a Python function called preprocess. Python is the language that I use to do the data preparation. So what this does, so here's where for anybody who hasn't seen like computer code before, so I define a function called preprocess that accepts text, and then it does some stuff to that text. So it converts it to lowercase. These little pound signs or hashtag signs are comments, meaning don't do this. So I left URLs in, removing non-ASCII characters, removing punctuation, stripping white spaces, and then here's where we talk about stop words. And then I removed really tiny words, and then the function returns that text for analysis. So these are pretty standard steps that we can take in pre-processing. And the commenting feature lets me turn some of those steps on and off to see how things change over time. And you can see that I added a bunch of stop words to the update, through update, sorry. So stop words are those words that we want to exclude from analysis because they're really common, so they don't carry much information, or the information they carry is misleading. And so I used the English stop word set, the Italian stop word set, and the Dutch stop word set from NLTK, which is a common language processing toolkit in Python. I can show you what those words are, but many of them are pronouns or things like helper verbs that don't carry much information. And then I added a bunch of these words here because they kept showing up, but they didn't actually provide much information. So those are the pre-processing steps that I'm following here, or at least in one of the analyses that I ran. We can change these. So we have control over what do we do to text before we analyze it. And the decisions that we make about processing lose or gain information in our analysis. And then I mentioned large language models and that we ought to tune them differently. What does that even mean? So a language model is a representation of natural language, where natural language is like what we speak or write. It's the language that occurs naturally. And those models are often expressed as probabilities. And a large language model is one that's really big. So it uses a ton of data. So maybe it used all of the English on the internet, or maybe it used everything from Wikipedia. And we use large language models to do things like chatbots. So like yesterday, I had to talk to Comcast. Comcast has a chatbot that tries to figure out what you want to talk about, or machine translation or summarize text. Language models often get used in moderation tools as well, but because they're trained on these really big text data sets, remember how tiny those probabilities that any individual word shows up were. So these things are really rare. So if we build these large language models on all language everywhere, then they are too general to catch these really niche and rare occurrences of words. And so we have to tune them or give them more examples or train them using human annotation or human in the loop to find some of the things that they wouldn't find on their own because they're too rare. You can read, they also have incredible environmental impact. And I've linked, and I'll put these slides up for you to be able to see sort of how much carbon gets dumped into the atmosphere when we build a large language model. So if they're not actually useful for what we're trying to do, are they really worth the costs of running them? And if you've been following Google AI, anytime in the last year and a half, you know that debates about large language models and when we and how we critique them and who does the critiquing are not unique to my talk, but have been in the news if that's the kind of news that you follow. So I'll go back to what should we do about it? We should de-emphasize profanity. We should adjust our pre-processing steps. We should be careful with our large language models. And we should train our moderators to be able to recognize some of the subtlety. So that's if we're trying to address white supremacy online. What should we do if we're trying to do this work? We should make sure to support it. It takes time and money to do this kind of work. And I'm thankful to the ADL and to ArcTS for making it possible for me to do this work. And there's a question in the chat that sets up my next slide, where how do I regulate my emotional response when studying such a topic? Sometimes not very well. So here are some recent examples where you're like, well, how bad is this really, or where does this happen? So these are tweets that U of M posted this morning about this talk. And then here's who's replying and what they have to say. So when I say support this work, I mean also the researchers and the targets of white supremacy online. And that those targets may not always be who you think they are, and they may be among us. So I invite you to go to Twitter and to see how are people talking about this talk even before it had occurred. And I will come back here to thanking folks for their support. And now I'm ready for Q&A. Thanks for your time. I think I stopped, right? Okay.
Thank you, Libby. So I'm going to start out with a few general questions, some of which are drawn from our Q&A list, but it seems you did a really nice screen in terms of thinking about what were sort of, I think, questions of method, right? And in terms of kind of people understanding sort of how you engage in your specific approach. But I have a question that really taps how people use these particular platforms. So people are talking with one another on Stormfront, for instance. They wouldn't need to alter the way they talk. They wouldn't be coding it in some sense. And how might we be missing people? How do you think about that potential bias that would enter in if on Twitter and Reddit they're using another form of language interaction?
This is the place where I get to say yes, and like they probably aren't modifying their speech when they're just talking to each other. And that makes it possible for us to see what is naturally occurring white supremacist speech. So when someone has said, I'm a white supremacist, and then they speak, that speech is white supremacist. Just like right now, I'm a white cis woman speaking. This is what white cis woman language looks like, or sounds like, I guess, if you're listening. And so we have some sort of natural language from them. That doesn't mean that we have all the ways in which they speak. It just means that we can learn something from how they talk when they don't think they're talking to an antagonistic audience. And so that's why we need to find speech from these many places, because we all code switch or adjust the way that we're talking depending on who we think is listening or who might be there. And that looking at all the different places where speech occurs and who's talking and how is a great goal. And that we need all of those different locations to understand naturally occurring language. So it would be biased if I stopped there, but we don't stop there. We look in other places and among other folks as well.
There's actually a question that I think intersects with both kind of the conceptual and methodological. Did Reddit content include user comments or only the original posts? So, but did you compare comments versus posts for differences? And this listener suggests that much of the mudslinging actually occurs in the commentary space and not in the original posting space. So I think that's a really interesting kind of question, both how we operate in these spaces, but then how you make choices methodologically.
Yeah, I think this is a good question. And these are actually Reddit comments, not Reddit posts. Okay. And in part because many of the posts, so these are comments on what's in r/all. So this comment or this question maybe came from a Redditor who understands these nuances that I didn't put in the talk. So I appreciate that. These are comments on posts that appeared in r/all. So the sample is all posts, and then from those posts grab 15,000 comments. And I think you're right that the mudslinging happens mostly in the comments, that Reddit posts compared to comments are relatively innocuous, except in places like the Donald that got shut down. And so, yeah, these are, again, the responses and the commentary on a particular item, whether it's like in our pics, which is just pictures, or politics or wherever. So yes, the comments is what I'm looking at.
Okay, great, thank you. So here's a nice question in thinking about your research support. So one listener asked, how is the ADL actually using these findings? How do they draw on your research to make choices?
So because the research isn't done, I can't comment on how they have done, but I can comment on like what is our hope or what might be useful. Right. The kinds of things that the ADL will do from here are educate policymakers. One of the biggest contributions of my report is actually, at least I understand them to be human, understandable descriptions of these really complicated computer science. Why does it matter? What does it mean to do topic modeling? Why does it matter? What is preprocessing? Why does it matter? That even talking about what are the decisions that we make when we're building computational methods, that is one way that ADL is going to use this. Another is to pressure platforms to say, like, why can Libby and her academic resources do this by herself, and you, Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, Reddit, are like, oh, we can't possibly, it's too hard. Like, yeah, there probably are some things that are too hard, and there are some that are like, nope, not that hard.
Well, on that point, another listener asked, what are the implications for platform governance, given your findings? And how might you advise those platforms that you just mentioned?
Sure. So I would tell them to stop policing profanity. Like, that's just aggressive tone policing. If tone policing is the like, when we tell somebody, well, if you just calm down, then we can talk about this. Like, sometimes it's totally legit for somebody to be so angry that they can't calm down, and that there's information in that emotion that we need to take into our moderation decisions. For those of you who have kids, this happens to my kid, right? It's the kid who fights back who gets in trouble. And so one thing that platforms can do is to figure out, why is the person fighting back? Like, what happened right before that? What was the antecedent of this action instead of the action? So when we look at something that's profanity, is it profanity in response to something that we ought to be mad about? Or is it profanity in response to something that's pretty innocuous? So for instance, one of the tweets that was a reply to the announcement of my talk today had profanity in it that Twitter flagged, because they're like, hey, you may not want to see this. Like, you don't need to shout profanity at me before I've even given my talk. Like, that's not justified profanity. If I said something that really made you mad, okay, then go ahead. But we hadn't even had the conversation yet. So let's look at profanity differently. They also need to do a better job with this just whiteness everywhere. That technology companies imagine the internet as a raceless place, and that's just not true. So part of why I showed that Reddit word embedding was to show that even on Reddit, in this like general place, Jews are racialized. Black folks are more likely to be associated with critical terms and with actions like raping and homosexuality and these other sort of either illegal or marginalized activities. And that's even in these normal sort of mainstream spaces. And so platforms need to do a better job of recognizing the sort of subtle ways in which white supremacy becomes the norm. And that by avoiding profanity and masking some of their intention, white supremacists are invited into spaces where that kind of hatred and toxicity isn't really welcome, and that we need to do a little bit better job on those subtleties instead of using really blunt hammers.
Mm-hmm. Here's a related question about change and thinking about tracking change, which I think is a really nice point. So this listener asks, how do you go about discovering changes in how white supremacists communicate? Mm-hmm. For example, there was a point where white supremacists were pluralizing tech company names to refer to minority groups. Mm-hmm. How do you identify that, track it, and how do you think about, right?
Yeah, they still do. Like, if you look up Google's and Skype's Skittles, like, these are all euphemisms that they've adopted. Word embeddings actually are a really easy way to find those. Nobody else uses the word Skypes and kill together, for instance. So like, that's just not a thing. Where those of us who are using Skype in an innocent or innocuous way are more likely to talk about login or internet issues, not about violence. And so those types of phrases are detectable when you look at what else is around them. So the individual word itself won't tell you, but the context in which it appears can be really useful. And then looking for euphemism, one thing that large language models are really actually useful for is showing us how language can change over time, because they start to show us how the probability of what the probability distribution for the next word is and how that distribution changes. Mm-hmm. So if we start to see that violence start to show up after Skype, then we know that something's going on with Skype. And those models make it possible to see those types of changes. And I know that Google is working on work in that space, and I know that there are probably some other organizations doing that too, to sort of figure out, now that we can model language in this way, what rarities can we detect that we hadn't looked for before.
Mm-hmm. Here's another methodological question, but it has some, I think, really important implications for how we're situating these findings. So the listener asks, how can we gather information on the location or region to examine associations between these online spaces?
So one of the dangers with social media data is that its metadata is not terribly reliable, which is both blessing and curse, because we ought to be afforded some level of anonymity online. And I think that's true even for white supremacists. But if we want to look at regional changes, we have to be able to do things like look at IP addresses or look at the geolocation on tweets. But there are lots of ways for that data to become noisy or inaccurate. And so we have to be careful about what conclusions we draw based on it. And it doesn't mean that we can't draw them, just that we need to hedge them and say, only 3% of users turn on their, and I don't know what the new number is. I'm just throwing that out there as one that used to be true. For tweets, only 3% of people are providing their location data. There's probably something about the other 97% that is different, but we don't know what that is. What we do know is among these 3%, here's what we find. So as long as we're careful and honest about the limitations of the conclusions that we can draw, I think it's probably okay. I think in Stormfront, we get IP addresses and the language of communication, which tells us something. So there's a lot of non-English on both Stormfront and Twitter that can tell you something about the sort of home language, even if not the geolocation. And we can use some of those. But I would caution that you want to make sure that the inferences that you're drawing are not, well, that they're valid and that they matter. So just because we can do it doesn't mean that we should.
So in another kind of question about can and should, this listener asks, have you thought about using these findings to work backwards on various parts of popular media? For instance, would we see similar patterns, perhaps not the most extreme words, but the word white more often used in certain places, news commentators, local newspapers, etc. Also, could historical documents show some similar patterns, and how might you situate these findings historically?
Sure. So one of the things that I wanted to do right from the jump in this project was actually to use KKK pamphlets as my white supremacy baseline. And I wanted to use these sort of historical documents and find out, have we changed the way that we talk, like about how do we do criticism, how do they do news coverage, et cetera. And the digitization of these original materials is one sort of set of resources that's helping make that possible. But you can imagine that maybe you don't want the KKK pamphlets to be all that accessible, because there's a very fine line between understanding and amplifying. And me, politically, I want to stay on the understanding side, but I don't want to be on the amplification side. So one way that we can do that is now that, because I am specialized in text data, so stuff like video, I'm just not that good at, but I can do transcripts. So we can start to look at media coverage in news and print. Now that they're digitized, many of the transcripts that get generated in order to provide closed captioning can be useful to let us look at these changes. Because I have been studying Congress for a long time, one of the things that's up next for me is to compare Stormfront to Congress. I don't have the answers for that yet, but stay tuned. I think we probably know how that's going to look and sort of who looks more like Stormfront and who looks more like sort of mainstream Reddit. But yeah, as we can digitize and make text out of print materials and video materials, we can do some of these comparative analyses. So that we can situate it better historically. So the results that I present today are a snapshot, and there's much work to be done from here.
It's an interesting question about sarcasm. So this listener asks, how do you tease out sarcasm, especially in uses of please or thank you? That's a nice.
Yeah.
And hard.
Maybe another Redditor, right? We say please and thank you a lot on Reddit when really we mean like, bless your heart. But that's not what we mean at all. Right. So sarcasm breaks sentiment analysis for sure, but I haven't done any sentiment analysis here. And it might be rude. So sarcasm might be rude. It's not necessarily white supremacist. So sarcasm is definitely a challenge for any sort of text analysis, especially automated text analysis. But it doesn't really come into play here because I'm not reasoning about the sentiment of comments.
I see. Yeah.
Or about the direction. But yeah, I'm on record as calling sarcasm detection bullshit like a couple of years ago, and I still stand by that. Like, we're just not good at it. But even humans, not that awesome at sarcasm detection. I mean, think about the last time that somebody said something sarcastic to you and you missed a beat. You're like, oh, they're kidding. Like, if humans aren't good at it, we can't teach machines to do it.
Great point, because we are teaching this machine. So, there are a couple of general questions about, I think you as a scientist and thinking about how you approach some of this that is really quite offensive, right? In a scientific manner, separating your own personal reactions. This is how I'm reading the listener's comment. Your own personal reactions from the work, and sort of thinking about how you maintain that.
Sure. So there are a couple of things. The first is to make sure that you have a team in place to support you when your job is to look at ugly all day. So for me, that means that I am a scientist, but I'm also a whole person. I do things like play tennis and watch TV. I just got a PS5 that I'm pretty excited about. Like, you have these things that let you take breaks from looking at the nasty. And I don't wear my headset right now to play the PS5 because I've got enough swearing in my life. I don't need it in my ears. So, that sounds like, oh, self-care is a solution, but no, like, self-care is necessary. And then there's other stuff you can do. So before I come into data analysis, and I was talking with the ISR media team about this morning, that I do guided meditations or listen to little video snippets or audio snippets before and after data analysis to separate it from all the other stuff in my life, that I don't want it to bleed into other things that I'm doing, but I want to be present and to honor the folks that are injured by this speech when I go into that space. So today, before this talk, I listened to some clips from a comic that I really like. Her name is Kimberly Clark. You can find her on YouTube. I think she's really funny, and she helped me relax before I come into a talk about stuff that's upsetting and that I don't want to be the case online, but I need to be ready for it. The other is, one challenge that I find especially hard is that often my PhD students want to be involved because this work matters. So if you take it to ADL, they're going to take it to Congress, they're going to take it to Facebook and say, like, let's do better. But there is often the students who I work with come from marginalized communities who are the targets of white supremacy. And so we have to be upfront with each other about what is realistic to expect from them, and for them to expect from themselves. So I won't ever tell a student, no, you can't work on this project, but I will say you can't start this work until you have your team in place, you have your mental health plan in place, you have your processes in place for dealing with the data, and you have a plan for how you're going to write it and what are you going to do when somebody comes for you online. And in this case, I ended up working on this project mostly by myself. I do have a student who helped with data collection, but the students were like, oh, I thought I could do it and I just can't, and that has to be okay. And I think that what leadership can do when you're looking at projects like mine or in this space is that if every time I'm going to do data analysis, I got to do something on the front and the back to get ready for it, it means I'm going to go slower. Like, I can't read Stormfront for 8 hours a day. I just can't do it. So it means that we need time to do work like this because we have to be able to come in and out and to take breaks. But if not now, when? And if not me, who? And so if these are the skills that I have, I need to use them in ways that matter. And I get to do that at Michigan.
That's so great. And I'm hesitating a bit about putting you on the spot, but I'm going to go ahead and do that. And say that, Libby, I'm sure you're open to our graduate students and others at the institution reaching out to you for advice in this kind of context. I completely agree with you that this is such important and fundamental work, but one would need to be well prepared to engage in it. Because it seems like, right, this one is in for the long haul, right, in terms of watching how this is shaping our discourse, shaping events like January 6th, which I'm sure people often ask you about in terms of whether this sort of dialogue and these platforms contributed, right, to that sort of event. But yeah, I'm hoping you will remain a resource for all of us, right, who are wanting to pursue these very important questions.
Yeah, I hope to, and I hope to make some of the data available as I can. And I am willing to be a resource, but I'm also only human. So just remember that I have time and energy and tolerance constraints just like everybody does. But if you are a student at U of M or a faculty member at U of M or another institution and you want to talk about sort of how do you do this work, or you want to know more about the details of method or something, do please contact me and we'll find a way to talk about it. It just may not be urgently.
Thank you, Libby. So we are at the hour. And I want to say what a terrific overview, both in methods and in substance. I think we all learned so much. All 200 of us participated today. So that's really extraordinary. And I hope you'll come back and present again as your work progresses.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody who attended, for your time and attention. I know those are limited resources, and I appreciate you sharing them with me today.
Great. Thanks so much.
Take care.